Morning, everyone, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to come and talk. What I want to get straight into is, Matt said right at the start that epidemiology is a slow study. Having a look over seasons and seasons and seeing what we can do to reduce injury risk. And my nature as a person is I don't like slow things. I want to try and get answers much faster. So what this talk revolves around is maybe a one team or a single team approach to how we might deal with injury. And the first question around it is why is it important for coaches? We get why it's important for World Rugby, because if their game has to change significantly because of the perceived injury risk, it might not be on TV and they might not make as much money. But why is it our job as a coach to worry about that? And the graph behind me hopefully illustrates that. If your players are injured less often, or your team spends less days with players on the injury list, you win more games, which means you get into more championships, you do more finals, and ultimately your team's performance and your reputation as a coach is enhanced. So how do we go about doing it? If it's such an important thing, we want to put steps in place to start addressing this injury problem. But where do we start? And the problem with it is that injuries are exceptionally complex. We've already spoken today about a few aspects: training load, neck strength, the FMC program have been brought up. But the truth is that any injury problem within a team is a result of a number of different things. It results from the type of athletes you've got, the level of rugby that they're playing at, the surface that they play on, their training history, their injury history. All of these things interact with each other to create what they call an emergent injury profile. So, the question that we ask out of that is, if there's so many things going on that are causing injuries, how do we determine which one to work on? Or if we work on one sort of injury risk factor, are we going to have a major outcome in terms of changing the injury risk profile for our team? And the answer to that is most likely not. Okay, changing one thing within a complex system, it's like when you set your cruise control and you're driving in your car. If the ultimate outcome is to drive at 70 miles an hour, if you come across a hill, the car changes the organization of the system to put more energy in so that you stay at 70. And if you start going down the hill, it changes the organization of the components within the system so that you stay at the same speed. So if you want to change the organizational hierarchy of your team's injury profile, you've got to make some significant changes. So the question is, how do we do that? And the message that I want to put out to coaches today is that if there's a whole lot of things going on and there's a whole lot that we've got to affect in order to change your overall injury profile for the team, you've got to use every tool in the box. And those tools don't just belong to you. Those tools tend to belong to all of the people within your multidisciplinary team. So we're talking about doctors, physiotherapists, sports scientists, strength and conditioning coaches, nutritionists, sports psychologists, and whoever else you may or may not have in your armory. But before we get to that, I want to talk about this. When we talk about injury risk factors, there will be things that we can modify and things that are just a given. You can't change the age of your player, and it's unlikely that you can do anything about their injury history. So those are things that we need to take into account. We need to understand them because it'll change what we can do to our players. But the truth is, some of the injury risk factors out there we simply have to accept. But the number one injury risk factor we know is how much load we place on our players. What do we ask them to do? And the big thing that coaches need to realize, and probably strength and conditioning coaches, sports scientists, and everyone else, is that the primary determinant of training load is the coach. Okay? Coaches are the ones who decide what the players do in every single session. Okay? Coaches are the ones who design the sessions, so implicitly they're deciding how hard the sessions are. So if there's an injury, if you'd like to improve the injury profile of your team, that's probably a very good starting point, is to consider whether the loads that your team are being exposed to are indeed appropriate. So this is an example of how I see a multidisciplinary approach working. Right in the middle of it, we've got the technical and tactical coaches and the strength and conditioning coaches. Because to me, coaches are coaches, and together, those two are deciding on the load that a team is exposed to. So it should probably be a joint responsibility for those two professionals to decide on the periodization. What are we going to do during different stages of the season? What are we doing during every single session? And how do we plan our training activities? But they don't have to do this in isolation, and this is what I'm talking about, using all the tools in your boxes. It is an exceptionally hard skill to understand what is going on in training. All of our players are different. All of them have different physical profiles, different positional demands. They are not the same, and the same training session given to a whole range of players is not going to be perceived the same. So how does a coach work within that level of complexity? You've got to use the tools that are available to you. So you've got a medical team in the form of physiotherapists and doctors. You've got a sports scientist, hopefully, and sometimes in smaller teams, those skill sets have to be picked up by other professionals. So sometimes the strength and conditioning coach ends up being a pseudo sports scientist because he's got to monitor the training load. But regardless of where you decide to get these information streams need to feed in to what you are deciding that your players are going to do on a day-to-day basis. And this is both a fast process and a slow process. It'll be a slow process when you start at the end of the season and you plan forward and you say, well, hamstring injuries were a problem for us previous year. So what can we do to address that? It can be a fast process where at the start of the week, just like Paddy showed us earlier, we can say, well, these players have been exposed to a lot of load, these players have been exposed to less. How can we modify our training during this week to make sure that we're giving the players what it is that they need? And the last important thing I'd like to say about this model is it's a feedback loop. As much as you're putting load and training programs and risk mitigation strategies into these athletes, the athletes are the ones that experience it, and they are the ones who react to it. So we need to then go back and get information from them and find out what it is that they are perceiving and receiving out of the training program so that we can modify again going forward. In terms of the slow approach to injury risk management, I've come up with this fairly simple strategy, and it starts with the top left corner, which is essentially an injury audit. So what you do is at the start of your season, or maybe midway through if you have that luxury, you sit down and you say, well, what has happened to us? What was the injury profile of this team last year? Okay. Now, why is that important? Because Mike and some of the work he's done and the guys at Bath, they can tell us what the injury profile is for the whole country playing rugby, which is exceptional. It's hugely valuable information. But that's not the injury profile for your team. The injury profile for your team is a direct reflection of the things that you've done to your team. So I used the example of hamstring injuries earlier. If there is a disproportional amount of hamstring injuries in your team, you can put that down to bad luck. Or you can say, what is it within our program that is causing this to happen? And can we modify that to change that in the future? So once you've done your audit, some things will pop out to you and you'll say, oh, that's not good. Or well done, we've done well in this area, let's keep doing that, but let's see how we can modify other things. So that's our risk assessment, our estimation and evaluation. And then we start talking about mitigation strategies. So once we understand what our injury problem is, what can we pile into the system to try and change our injury risk outcome? And this is the toolbox. And this is where I say use the toolbox liberally. Open it up and find every single thing that you can get out of there that might make a difference to your injury outcomes. So what I'm going to talk about now is a practical example that I was involved with in professional rugby in South Africa, and how we piled a couple of these different mitigation strategies into a single team. Now, was there a cause-effect relationship? Can we pull out one of these and say that it was the one that made the difference? No, we can't, because complex systems aren't like that. Sometimes you change something in a complex system, but in the absence of changing the other few things, your intervention doesn't work. Okay, but these are the things that we had a look at. First of all, we had a look at a dynamic movement screening. We used the functional movement screen, and we essentially said if you can't get into quality body positions, the chances of you being in effective positions for the tackle, especially when under fatigue, are much less. So that affects your tackle technique. So you're putting yourself in an at-risk position more often. So let's try and address that. Then we said, what about conditioning interventions? There was, at the time, this nice research study from Tim Gabbett was floating around saying that if you have sufficient shoulder strength, you have much lower risk of shoulder contact injuries. Brilliant. Tick that box. Make sure our guys have sufficient shoulder strength. If they have sufficient aerobic fitness capacities, they get injured less often. Fantastic. Let's make sure that our guys are as fit as they need to be. So pile all of that into your system. Beyond that, we made sure that we were getting our training prescriptions right. So we had the facility, because of the sports scientist involved, to be able to look back at our own system historically and identify what training loads were the most effective for us. And funny enough, because we see this quite a lot in rugby, we get this U-shaped graph. There was a training load that was too high that was causing us injuries. There was a training load that was too low that was also causing us injuries. But somewhere in the middle was the sweet spot. And once we understood that there was a sweet spot, we could try and hit that every single week. On top of that, we recognized that a lot of the contact injuries we were receiving were problems related to poor contact and tackling technique. So what did we do? Rather than shying away from contact and training, we added more of it, because we said, if that's the thing that's causing the injury problem, let's make sure that we're doing everything in our power to address that. So we tackled more frequently, short, high-intense bursts of tackling at almost every training session. And the last thing was to build in improved sports science services in terms of monitoring recovery and fatigue in the players, and providing that information to coaches timelessly in order to allow them to affect the system. So what was the result of all of that? Small but meaningful reductions in the team injury risk over the course of 3 seasons, which, lucky for us, corresponded with really good improvements in the team's playing performance at the time. And that sort of self-fulfilling prophecy really helps get coaches on board, because when they see a graph like that, and at the same time their results are going pretty well, they decide to reinvest and redouble their efforts in terms of that. But last little slide I wanted to get in there was particularly this around contact injuries. So the previous slide I was showing, that was our overall injury outcomes. But in particular, we unexpectedly, because we always thought that if we get the training loads right, what will happen is our non-contact injuries will go down. But where we found that we got the greatest gains through this multifactorial type of get everyone involved, is we managed to reduce contact injuries, and we did that in the context of tackling more in training. So the story of that last graph is that significant reduction in shoulder injuries, very significant reduction in concussion injuries, and hopefully I've managed to paint a picture about how all of the different role players within that system fitted into the overall win. So to leave here saying that I do believe that it's possible to improve your team's injury risk profile. I do think that that's possible in the short term without long-term epidemiology studies, but I think that in order for that to happen, all of the role players within the team, all the tools in the toolbox need to be on board and pulling in the same direction. Thanks very much.